Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor for me to introduce Gerald Kennedy, an outstanding scholar on Poe and the short story. He has published abundantly, and I will just read some of his curriculum. Gerald Kennedy is Poet Professor of English at Louisiana State University and a former chair of the Department of English. He also served as president of the International Poe Studies Association and as vice president of the Ernest Hemingway Foundation and Society. Most of his work as a scholar has focused either on the early 19th century American literature and culture or on the expatriate modernists who converged on Paris in the early 20th century. He has been twice a Taylor Fellow at the University of Virginia, and in 2017, he was a writing residency fellow at the Rockefeller Center in Villaggio, Italy. His books on Poe include Poe, Death, and the Life of Writing, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, and The Abyss of Interpretation, a new edition of the portable Edgar Allan Poe, and 3 edited and co-edited collections of essays, The Historical Guide to Edgar Allan Poe, Romancing the Shadow, Poe and Race, and Poe and the Remapping of Antebellum Print Culture. He has co-edited the New Oxford Handbook of Edgar Allan Poe, and Kennedy's career capping study, Strange Nation, Literary Nationalism, and Cultural Conflict in the Age of Poe, won the Patrick F. Quinn Award from the Poe Studies Association. Kennedy has also published on contemporary American short story and edited modern American short story sequences, composite fictions, and fictive communities. He has also produced a popular paperback edition of The Life of Black Hawk. His current work in progress will distill 40 years of teaching Poe into a trade book for general readers that explains the author's ballooning popularity and visibility in the 21st century. It traces the onset of a culture of fear fostered by the rise of electronic media, new technologies of mass destruction, and the advent of terrorism. So today he will speak about Poe, Griffith, and the White Republic. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa, and thank you, Viorica and Ana, and the whole team here at Salamanca for doing such an incredible job of organizing this and making everyone feel welcome. Your gift for hospitality is spectacular. And I also wanted to thank my wife, Sarah, who has helped me a lot with PowerPoints many times, but I think she especially did some magic on this one. And I'm glad the room is open now so that we can have the meeting. When I came at 10 till, it was still locked. My blood pressure is now down to a place where I think I can do this. So anyway, without further ado, and by the way, this paper, it struck me that all of the previous keynotes, I've pulled off something. There is a connection. Marjorie talked about Eliot's line of purifying the dialect of the tribe, which of course comes from Mallarmé's sonnet, Le Tombeau d'Edgar Poe. And after that, Gordon reminded us that American history is always written over another history that is largely suppressed or has been made invisible. And I'm going to be pulling elements of that history into the open in this talk. I also, Christine's talk touched on cultural amnesia, and that's indeed another part of this paper that I'm going to give. And last Mario this morning gave a wonderfully sophisticated theoretical approach to reading films and thinking about representation in films. And all I can say is that he filled in what I could not supply, which is sort of the deep theory behind the beginnings of American cinema. And I'm going to start with D.W. Griffith. This paper begins with Griffith, and then it takes a deep dive into Poe, and then comes back to Griffith at the end. So hold on. Here we go. In 1915, the emerging film genius D.W. Griffith directed a silent epic called The Birth of a Nation and changed Hollywood movie making forever. He also provoked outrage by ridiculing African Americans, romanticizing the Ku Klux Klan, and asserting on one title card that the vigilante group was fighting, quote, in defense of their Aryan birthright. The film was the first movie to stir nationwide protest of its objectionable content, but it was also the first great box office hit, a fact that speaks volumes about the cultural divisions of that era. Griffith made almost 500 movies and introduced the grammar of cinematic storytelling that still dominates the film industry. Yet his career was forever tainted by the racism of his most brilliant achievement. Today I begin with Griffith because he opens a new angle on the conflicted nature of American nationalism and on Poe's resistance to its more insidious elements. In 1909, the centennial of Poe's birth, when Griffith was still making short Nickelodeon movies for Biograph Films, he produced a 7-minute biopic called Edgar Allan Poe. Yep, he misspelled the author's middle name the same way your students do. Biographer Richard Schickel notes that Griffith had, quote, a strong literary identification with Poe, but what does this identification actually reveal about Griffith or Poe? And why did Griffith build his first feature-length film, The Avenging Conscience, around the Telltale Heart and Annabel Lee? If Griffith idolized Poe as the leading poet of the Old South, as I think we can assume, why did he fail to grasp Poe's antebellum critique of the White Republic Griffith and others aspired to rebuild after the Civil War and Reconstruction? Scott Simon has called Griffith incontestably the most troubling figure in American film, and a similar claim might be made about Poe's place in U.S. literary history, or at least antebellum history. The juxtaposition of these troubling storytellers from the Upper South may illuminate a dark corner of national history. Griffith's curious fixation with Poe invites a rethinking of the way both men grappled with problems of race and destiny confronting their native land. As I suggested in Strange Nation, the United States has had from its origins in 1776 been caught between two clashing, mutually contradictory ideas of citizenship and national belonging. An ethnic nationalism rooted in archaic notions of Anglo-Saxon superiority. And here are some of the elements of that, looking to the Pilgrims, the Puritans, as the founders of the nation, the famous painting of the Declaration of Independence where you have all white men at the founding moment of the Republic. Congress was largely Anglo-Saxon Protestant until Reconstruction, and of course, more recently, all U.S. presidents were, quote, white until Barack Obama. I put the word white in quotation marks very deliberately because this whole paper is really built around the problematic construction of whiteness. Opposing this model of citizenship is civic nationalism, which is built upon respect for law, upholding founding principles, pledging allegiance in the most fundamental sense. It is built around the inalienable rights of the Declaration, and it has been reasserted in the face of ethnic nationalism in the amendments that created voting rights for African Americans and eventually for Native Americans. And of course, anyone can become a citizen of the United States, I think, still. Naturalization affords legal immigrants a path to citizenship. So the question of who belongs to the nation is really at the crux of the paper that I'm presenting today. The failure of an American president to condemn the white nationalist march in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 speaks volumes about the virulent racism still plaguing the land of the free. And as Sarah Churchwell has lately pointed out in Behold America, the same president's revival of the slogan America First evokes the repressive ideologies of the 1920s, when America First meant isolationism and signaled a preoccupation with being 100% American, that is, white, native-born, and Protestant. Almost a century ago, that movement spurred a wave of brutality threatening the civil rights of immigrants and people of color. As the image on the left suggests, the 20s and 30s saw a massive resurgence of U.S. political hatred rooted in ideas of white racial supremacy. Churchwell discusses this huge Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden in 1926. And in 1938, the German-American Bund proudly proclaimed George Washington the first Nazi fascist. That really creates some whiplash. Parades by American fascists took place in New York and Chicago. Probably the most menacing development of all was the great revival of the Ku Klux Klan, largely inspired by Griffith's Birth of a Nation. By 1925, the Klan had reached a national membership approaching 5 million. That year, some 30,000 Klansmen paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington without their hoods, flaunting their public acceptance as a 100% patriotic group. According to Churchwell, some 75 members of Congress identified themselves in the mid-20s as Klan members, and many owed their election to Klan support. The group's vigilante activities included public lynchings, castrations, cross burnings, and other forms of racial intimidation, all the while that advertising specialists had been hired to promote the Klan's community work. These right-wing groups shared a nationalism that conceived of the United States as a white republic. That idea had a long history. As Reginald Horseman has documented in his classic study of Anglo-Saxonism, the belief in a white racial superiority had pervaded every section of the United States during the antebellum era, and helps to explain anti-abolitionist sentiment in the North. According to historian Edward Bloom, the idea of a white republic reunited people of Western European heritage, North and South, after the Civil War, aligning them against newly freed blacks, as well as the radical Republicans who had imposed Reconstruction. This is the image in the background of Bloom's cover. The image of heaven has a swirling cloud of white male faces. The white majority reasserted racial dominance with Jim Crow segregation laws, voting restrictions, hate crimes, as ethnic nationalism reasserted itself after a decade of civic nationalism, that is, the period of Reconstruction. Sectional rapprochement and the reconsolidation of white power lay at the heart of Thomas S. Dixon's 1905 novel, The Klansman, which in turn provided the plotline for Griffith's Birth of a Nation. In both novel and film, post-war marriages that link a Southern family to a Northern one signify the triumph of white racial solidarity over sectional division. The film's enactment of a mounted charge by masked white-robed riders determined to save a white woman from a black rapist gave strong impetus in 1915 to the organization of the Klan, which was soon asserting the benign respectability of white nationalism, and that claim surfaces with remarkable frequency. This historical contextualizing underscores Griffith's cinematic celebration of whiteness, a highly problematic concept, as I will suggest, but also frames the fascinating problem of his devotion to Poe. In addition to his biopic, Edgar Allan Poe, Griffith in 1909 also made a 12-minute revenge tragedy called The Sealed Room, inspired by the Cask of Amontillado. That's the picture on the left. There, a king calls upon stonemasons to seal up his unfaithful mistress in an airtight room with her second lover, the court musician. In the last minutes of the action, we watch the couple suffocate. Then in 1914, Griffith built a feature-length film, The Avenging Conscience, around the Telltale Heart. And to this quite bizarre project, I'm going to return in my closing. Like Poe, Griffith adored pale, ethereal women who looked as if they had been marked for death. The son of a Confederate colonel from Kentucky, Griffith embraced the myth of the Confederacy's lost cause, believing the South to be noble, heroic, and doomed by Northern wealth, in much the same way that Poe conceived a beautiful woman's death to be the most poetical of all subjects. That's just the way it is. Poe made his most famous claim about the aesthetic appeal of dying women in The Philosophy of Composition, an essay purporting to explain how he wrote The Raven. Griffith built his melodrama, his 1909 Poe biopic, around the troubled composition of that very poem, and in the process, he projected Poe as a champion of lost causes. Griffith's biographical film depicts Virginia Poe dying of consumption as the writer transforms his grief into poetry, a process inspired here by a black bird, very stuffed and silent, not one that talks, that materializes suddenly above his writing table, perched on a white classical bust. It's worth noting here that quite a few recent scholars in discussing the raven have associated the bird's blackness with race, especially as the feathered visitor imposes itself on an emblem of pure whiteness. With a few pen strokes, Poe dashes off the poem and rushes to find a publisher, while Virginia, played by Griffith's wife, Linda Arvidsson, coughs, writhes, and dies in just a couple of minutes. When an editor recognizes the brilliance of the poem, and that's the image on the right, he hands Poe a few dollars, allowing the author to return to Virginia with some urgent provisions. And as Poe bends over her, he realizes that she is gone. And in despair, he flings himself upon her lifeless body. In actuality, of course, Poe published The Raven fully 2 years before Virginia's death, but the film possesses a certain cultural logic as Griffith's tribute to the man he regarded as the South's greatest poet. While there is nothing explicitly Southern about the speaker's torment in The Raven, Poe's loyalty to Virginia here may be read as both conjugal and regional devotion, insofar as his wife bore the name of his adopted home state. That's a stretch. The question of whether Poe, born in Boston but raised mostly in Richmond, fits the image of a Southern author has long provoked critical controversy. At the time Griffith produced his biopic, scholars at the University of Virginia were eagerly reclaiming Poe as the school's most famous dropout. But Poe spent most of his career as a magazinist in New York and Philadelphia, and he largely avoided the sectional controversy in his editorial remarks, except when he was mocking residents of Boston as Frogpondians. He did sell a slave for his aunt in Baltimore, and he was residing in that city when the shocking confessions of Nat Turner were published there in 1831. Poe had grown up among slaves, heard ghost stories from a bondsman named Armistead Gordon, and at the Southern Literary Messenger in 1836, worked within eyesight of the Richmond slave market. But when Poe broke with John Allen, he also abandoned any future place in the slaveocracy of the Upper South. In reviews, Poe sometimes repeated the necessary evil argument for slavery, and without question, he found immediate abolition a frightening proposition. His nightmarish idea of possible reprisal by former slaves infuses the massacre of Anglo-American sailors by black natives near the end of the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. More recent scholars have fully exposed the racially coded implications of such works as Pym, the Journal of Julius Rodman, and The Gold Bug. My friend John Carlos Rowe, the most prominent contemporary critic to characterize Poe as an apologist for slavery, has recurrently indicted the author for racist and imperialist attitudes, and he would likely view Griffith's homage to Poe as a corroboration of sorts. But there's plenty of evidence pointing to another conclusion, that Griffith's idealization of Poe betrays his own misreading of the poet's relationship to the South and to Anglo-Saxon superiority. Among his white antebellum contemporaries, Poe's racism was in reality quite average and unremarkable, as Terence Whalen has brilliantly argued. What now seems unusual, however, is his adamant opposition to literary nationalism, which led in his satires to mockery of Anglo-Saxon progress and ingenuity. In this sense, he was hardly a typical Southerner. And to solidify this point, I need to dive into Poe's contested writings. In this project, Nell Painter's 2010 study, The History of White People, provides a well-informed perspective on the problem of race. According to Painter, the modern preoccupation with racial difference arose in the later 18th century, when German art historian Johann Winkelmann popularized an idea of white beauty based on Greek painting and sculpture. By the end of the century, Johann Blumenbach's influential treatise on human variety, based on comparative skull shapes, formed the basis for later, quote, scientific studies of racial groups. As Painter notes, Blumenbach assigned the name Caucasian to a range of European peoples supposed to derive from the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. It was an idea, she says, as much mythical as geographical. Blumenbach's colleague Christoph Meiners wrote the foundations of the history of mankind to praise the beauty of the Tartar Caucasian race and to construct a hierarchy of European ethnicities, extolling Nordic Teutonic folk as supreme. Thanks to Goethe and Madame de Stael, these ideas were romanticized as German racial superiority, and it entered into Anglo-American discourse about race, perhaps indirectly exciting Thomas Jefferson's insistence on America's Anglo-Saxon origins. And it certainly fueled what Painter calls the Teutonic Saxon race chauvinism of both Thomas Carlyle and Ralph Waldo Emerson, which culminated in Emerson's case in the ominous essays of his 1852 volume, English Traits. As this shifting taxonomy suggests, there was nothing very precise about what it meant to be white. That emerged mostly in rhetorical comparison with other supposedly inferior races. Well, a full reckoning of Poe's response to the problematic idea of whiteness, or the corollary idea of a white republic, exceeds the time available to me. I'm going to focus now briefly on Pym and Toni Morrison's crucial insights on Poe before touching on a handful of edgy satires, emphasizing three in particular that epitomize Poe's critique of Anglo-Saxon national self-worship. Morrison's Playing in the Dark, as you recall, credits Poe with inventing American Africanism in Pym via the elaborate color contrast seen in The Taboo that terrifies the black islanders, but also in the gigantic snowy figure in the closing paragraph. Well, it may be argued that this looming presence epitomizes the very principle of whiteness that Painter describes, and thus represents a magical deliverance from the threat of blackness embodied by the natives of Salal. We never know whether the phantasm is real or illusory, whether it portends life or death. What Poe has enabled us to see through the closing chapters of the novel is that both dark-skinned people and light-skinned people rely upon black-white color oppositions to ascribe meaning to experience. They perceive their own supposed color as normative and natural, while its opposite connotes evil or death. Poe also allows the reader to grasp the natives' aversion to whiteness in their reaction to a pan of flour, a ship's sails, and the like. But curiously, and this has always fascinated me, Pym fails to notice this portentous pattern himself, and so cannot anticipate the massacre that kills most of the Anglo-American crew of the Jane Guy. He thus fails to comprehend anything the natives say, dismissing it as mere meaningless jabber, because the colonizing trick presumes the vast superiority of civilized understanding over savage ignorance. In short, Pym is so convinced that Anglo-civilization entitles the white man to exploit these dark-skinned natives that he and his companions trick themselves. In this sense, the gigantic figure of snowy whiteness may represent a belated, ironic reflection of racial self-delusion. Poe's concerted satire of U.S. ethnocentrism and the national habit of self-glorification gives special interest to his 1839 tale, The Man That Was Used Up, and I know this has been cited in several other presentations in the last couple of days. Read today mostly by scholars or their students, the title plays on an expression meaning to annihilate someone critically. The subject of a scathing review was said to be used up. Poe's mystery figure at the heart of this story is a famous Indian fighter who has killed so many native people that he has become a national hero. But there is a secret about General John A.B.C. Smith that no one wants to mention. The general provides a teasing hint, though, when he tells the narrator, "We are a wonderful people and live in a wonderful age. Parachutes and railroads, man-traps and spring guns. Our steamboats are upon every sea, and our Nassau balloon packet is about to run regular trips between London and Timbuktu." There's really no end to the march of invention. By the end of the tale, we learn that prosthetic inventions let Smith project a robust public image. By wonderful people, he means Anglo-Saxon Americans, here credited with the invention of the steamboat and railroad, but also preposterously with balloon flights between London and Africa. There are so many, quote, truly useful mechanical contrivances in North America, Smith adds, that inventions seem to be springing up like grasshoppers. Likening new products to grasshoppers connotes an emerging commodity culture of ravenous appetite. The phrase March of Invention echoes the popular phrase March of Civilization, then closely associated with westward movement. The ideology of progress was in 1839 already exciting belief that Anglo-Saxon Americans were destined to conquer and occupy North America. The specifically white nationalism implied here in Poe's caricature of Smith becomes more understandable when we learn about the general's exploits against the Kickapoos, a real tribe from the American Midwest, and the Bugaboos, a completely made-up tribe, a word which signifies a bogus threat. The general has been fighting way down south because in 1839, the U.S. Army was waging a second feudal war against the Seminole Indians in Florida. Whether or not Poe based his caricature of Smith on then commander of the Army, General Alexander Macomb, the manly features ascribed to Smith form part of a complicated deception. We learn that the general is himself an invention, a construction of artificial parts reassembled each day by his slave and valet Pompey, so that Smith can parade as a national hero. In the comic final scene, Poe reveals that everything about Smith is false. His limbs, his voice, his shoulders, his eyes, his thick black hair. So is his renown. Smith is a fire eater, a man consumed by his own passion for killing Indians, and he has been used up not by the Kickapoos or Bugaboos, but by his own racial hatred. Poe would later lament that Americans had, quote, unmercifully despoiled, assassinated, and dishonored the original inhabitants of North America. General Smith personified that murderous ethnocentrism, and in the tale's original version, Poe has Pompey pretend to shoot his master. It's a wonderful little detail that got dropped. The man that was used up announced a shift in Poe's practice as a writer of magazine fiction. Previously, his short tales had always represented old world scenes and situations. He alluded to U.S. subjects only obliquely. But after his expose of the Indian killer, Poe focused more than half of his subsequent tales on explicitly American themes and settings. Many of them were satirical or had an ironic edge. In 1840, the businessman continued this trend, mocking the conniving Yankee capitalist, possibly based also on an idea of John Allen, his foster father. And the sketch, The Philosophy of Furniture, took a shot at the vulgarity of American culture. Then in January 1842, in an introduction to the book review section of Graham's magazine, Poe registered a personal gripe. Nationalism was perverting literature, compelling authors to produce idealized versions of American life, and forcing reviewers into the gross error of liking a stupid book the better because, sure enough, its stupidity was American. It's a great quote, and it was so good that Poe used it 2 or 3 other times as a reviewer. Writers like himself who preferred the foreign subject felt ostracized, yet Poe could not finally resist the pressure, and his 1843 tale, The Gold Bug, set in South Carolina, seemed to mark a capitulation to the editorial demand for American subjects. But that tale, covertly about piracy and literary capital, uncovers gold coins from Europe. Poe notes tellingly, there was no American money. That's a complaint about the fortunes of the American author. By 1844, when Henry Clay and James K. Polk were battling to become president, Poe was in New York experiencing a mania for composition that generated more tales than in any other single year of his career. As I suggested a while ago, several stories contain passing shots at national arrogance. The Spectacles tells of a nearsighted young man who mistakenly proposes to his French great-grandmother. He's very nearsighted, and she remarks that he epitomizes the foolishness of "de stupide Amérique." In The Oblong Box, which Bonnie McMullen has written about very beautifully, a New York packet ship named the Independence sinks off the coast of North Carolina on or about the 4th of July. Very suggestive. Another story from 1844, A Tale of the Ragged Mountains, recalls the landscape around Charlottesville to insinuate a troubling analogy between British imperialism in India and the unfinished U.S. project of Indian removal. A reenactment of the 1785 Chete Singh Rebellion unfolds amid the Ragged Mountains and seems to portend Native American reprisal for being, quote, unmercifully dispossessed. The politics of the 1844 election helped to clarify Poe's national satire. While Clay and the Whigs mostly argued against territorial expansion, such as the annexation of Texas, and it's impossible to tell, especially from a distance, but that is the theme, the subject of the larger cartoon on the left. That's Polk doffing his top hat on the upper right, trying to pull Texas into the Union, and these are the Whigs pulling the line that's in the bottom part. That's Henry Clay at the first of the characters dangling from the clothesline, or so it seems. Polk, during this campaign, Polk advanced a belligerent ideology with the slogan 54-40 or fight, staking a huge claim to land held by the British in the Pacific Northwest. But Polk was even more eager to add Texas to the Union and to invade Mexico to crush opposition to the annexation of a former Mexican possession. As a Tennessee slaveholder, Polk knew that bringing Texas into the Union would add another slave state and, if the entire Southwest could be annexed, potentially extend the slave South to the Pacific coast. To avoid antagonizing anti-slavery Northerners, however, the Democrats promoted the acquisition of Texas as an expansion of liberty and democracy. They voiced confidence in the nation's manifest destiny to govern the entire continent. The ideal was irresistibly flattering, and it still is. It implied that the almighty creator of the universe had chosen Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans to subjugate not only African American slaves and Native American tribes, but also Mexican Catholics in the Southwest. Manifest Destiny encouraged national self-worship and accelerated the formation of a specifically white nationalism, that is, belief in a white race, which had no historical basis or legitimacy, but had been evolving under the banner of Anglo-Saxon achievement in the 1830s and 40s. Manifest Destiny soon became more than an ephemeral political slogan. The phrase gave coherence and legitimacy to a dubious concept of racial entitlement. While whiteness was emerging as an object of study by craniologists such as Samuel George Morton and Josiah Nott, Manifest Destiny gave it political force. The idea of a superior white race gained clarity through the relentless demonizing of Mexicans as a mongrel population. Those who opposed the conquest of all of Mexico for reasons of racial complication, pointed out that pure Castellanos formed only a small minority in Mexico, and that most Mexicans by then had mixed African or Indian blood, or both. Polk's Secretary of State, James Buchanan, insisted in 1845 that, quote, Anglo-Saxon blood could never be subdued by anything that claimed Mexican origin. And of course, Buchanan became president himself. This painting, a graphic depiction of Anglo-Saxon manifest destiny by the German immigrant Emanuel Leutze, covers an entire wall in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It's there today. You can walk in and check it out. It provides enduring evidence of the specifically white nationalism that drove the election of 1844 and the subsequent war with Mexico. Poe had quite a different view of his country. If he caricatured African Americans according to commonplace stereotypes, he also flatly rejected the notion that Jacksonian America represented the pinnacle of Western civilization and progress. Indeed, he was appalled by the popular democracy of the 1830s and blamed Jackson for creating a culture of violence that promoted mobbing and rioting. Poe's seldom discussed backwoods detective story, Thou Art the Man, the second tale to receive closer attention, critiques both the populist demagogue and the ignorant crowd. Through most of this tale, handsome, forthright Charlie Goodfellow leads the townspeople of Rattleboro in a search for the killer of wealthy old Mr. Shuttleworthy. As Shuttleworthy's supposed best friend, Charlie affects distress at the strange disappearance of his neighbor, and with masterful innuendo, he casts suspicion on Mr. Pennyfeather, a nephew of the deceased, who stands to profit from his death. But smiling Charlie turns out to be the vicious murderer, and his manipulation of the townspeople amounts to clever misdirection. His method recalls the formula for deception laid out in Poe's 1843 tale, Diddling. A con man requires, quote, minuteness, interest, perseverance, ingenuity, audacity, nonchalance, originality, impertinence, and grin. Charlie's performance of white manhood also typifies the Jacksonian demagogue, whose seeming openness and sincerity conceals his maneuvering as well as his greed and brutality. But the genius of the tale, the crux of its social satire, lies in Poe's analysis of collective ignorance. The Anglo-Saxon citizens of Rattleboro operate as a genteel mob. Charlie persuades them to search for Shuttleworthy's body en masse so that he can lead them to evidence he himself has planted. 3 times, Charlie refers to the townspeople as a crowd when they all catch the innuendo of Charlie's innocent remark that incriminates Pennyfeather, when they fall into subsequent bickering, and when they angrily take Pennyfeather into custody. But the most telling allusion to Jacksonian mobbing comes when Charlie uses his eloquence, supposedly to defend Pennyfeather. Quote, yet it so happened, somehow or other, that every syllable he uttered, out of which the direct but unwitting tendency was not to exalt the speaker in the good opinion of his audience, had the effect of deepening the suspicion already attached to the individual whose cause he pleaded, and of arousing against him the fury of the mob. That's the rhetorical smoking gun, the fury of the mob. Poe shows how popular democracy has become a mechanism of deception and domination. Far from representing the pinnacle of civilization, Jacksonian America has revealed, to Poe at least, a new form of tyranny, mob rule by the consummate confidence man. Yet this tale delivers poetic justice when the narrator, a detective ventriloquist, grasps Charlie's manipulations, solves the crime, and then induces his confession by having Mr. Shuttleworthy's corpse pop out of a wine crate to tell his killer, "Thou art the man." That's the cartoon on the right. Poe saved his most comprehensive debunking of Anglo-Saxonism, however, for the third tale, Some Words with a Mummy, from 1845. Without background information, readers today can hardly appreciate the stakes of this debate. The real-life experts here include George R. Glidden, an actual English-born American Egyptologist. Glidden was a close associate of the noted craniologist Morton, who had just published Crania Egyptica, arguing, as Nell Painter notes, that Egyptian skulls closely resembled those of, quote, the modern white man. Glidden supported Morton's argument that because the Egyptian rulers achieved such a highly developed civilization, they must have been white. Surprise. But the aficionados of Egyptology who gather to unwrap Poe's mummy see themselves as far superior to the Egyptian. Poe indeed seems intent on destroying the illusion that his contemporaries are in any way more remarkable than the dark-skinned inhabitants of ancient Egypt. He insists that the visitor from North Africa is of a distinctly reddish complexion, perhaps wishing to associate him with Native Americans. The tale evokes several issues pertinent to the election of 1844. The author embeds in his tale a scathing summary of the jingoistic notions that handed the election to Polk. In 4 domains, the Egyptian punctures the illusions of cultural superiority manifested by his white interrogators. These are history writing, ethnology, technology, and political philosophy. Poe had already recognized the tendency of Anglo-Saxon history to romanticize westward movement by ignoring its genocidal consequences. That's what The Man That Was Used Up reveals. Because Egyptians valued historical accuracy, the mummy got himself embalmed, brains and bowels intact, so that he could return 5 centuries later to correct mistakes and prevent history from generating into absolute fable, as had American history by implication. Poe undercuts Morton's argument for Anglo-Saxon racial superiority when the mummy explains how 5 major races emerged simultaneously and developed independently. Unlike Morton, the mummy describes a version of polygenesis that differentiates Egyptian achievement from Anglo-Saxon innovation. His comparison of the U.S. Capitol building with the Palace of Karnak reveals how far the technological accomplishments of ancient Egypt have surpassed the supposed marvels of modern America. Poe truly implies an embarrassing lag in Anglo-American achievement. The New Yorkers tout the Bowling Green Fountain in New York as a great wonder of the world. But the mummy's most trenchant proof of superior ancient wisdom exposes delusions about American democracy. The Count cites a brief failed experiment in the land of the pharaohs when 13 provinces determined all at once to be free and so set a magnificent example for the rest of mankind. Their ingenious constitution created quick prosperity, but their habit of bragging was prodigious, the Count says. The proliferation of new states produced the most odious and insupportable despotism that was ever heard upon the face of the earth. The mummy identifies the usurping tyrant as mob. Here Poe blasts American exceptionalism and Jacksonian mobbing, hinting that popular democracy excites the people to violence, bigotry, rioting, and odious notions of Anglo-Saxon privilege. In the 1840s, there was much talk about racial superiority. Those of mixed of the Americans, those of mixed European ancestry, who embraced the fiction of Anglo-Saxonism to deny the reality described 60 years earlier in Krevker's Letters of an American Farmer. And this is a passage many of you probably know and use in your teaching, that white Americans composed a promiscuous breed, a strange mixed race of many ethnicities. By 1845, Anglo-Saxonists were furiously flaunting their racial purity and superiority, preparing to wage war on the mongrel Mexicans to expand their territorial extent by almost half. Such demonizing made it easier to kill adversaries. Poe's narrator, however, has had enough. He declares himself heartily sick of this life and of the 19th century in general, and he adds, "I am convinced that everything is going wrong." He decides to get himself embalmed so that he can sleep 2 centuries and come back to find out who will be president in 2045. Perhaps the ancient Egyptian has opened his eyes to the scandal of manifest destiny and white American nationalism. Who will be elected U.S. president in 2020? That question relates closely to the one Poe's narrator asks. For the presidency of Barack Obama reasserted the idea of U.S. civic nationalism, the belief that anyone, regardless of race or ethnicity, may be an American and, if born on U.S. soil, elected president. But the current administration has reasserted ethnic nationalism, demonizing Muslims, Latinos, and blacks, while tacitly reviving the notion that white skin confers belonging, privilege, and power. Poe had only a raw awareness of competing nationalisms, and indeed his satire of American self-worship seems so preposterous and esoteric that one wonders if any contemporary readers really understood his mockery. He kept up the critique, however, and in Malanta Tata, a late spin-off, he took an even longer view of national destiny. There, Poe's nattering narrator Pundita and her husband Pundit are in a balloon, now in 2848, overflying what used to be New York City, and the ruins below inspire amusement as at the delusions of the Americans, their odd notion of equality, their naive faith in voting and election fairness, and their susceptibility to mass delusions. Poe did not accept absolute equality and emphasized innate differences within all groups. Neither did he live to see the war between the states or the rebuilding of the White Republic in the 1880s and 1890s. But he would have ridiculed both the Anglo-Saxon panic that incited later U.S. immigration restrictions and the corollary rise of modern eugenics. It was some words with a mummy all over again, with white theorists trying to prop up a subjective notion of their own racial superiority with scientific evidence. Such men as Francis Galton, William Ripley, Lothrop Stoddard, Madison Grant, Charles Davenport, and Henry Goddard constructed the theories of race that anticipated Hitler's exalting of Nordic supremacy. It is also hard to imagine that Poe, who dreaded mobs, would have been enthralled by D.W. Griffith's celebration of the White Republic in The Birth of a Nation with its Aryan birthright proclaimed by that violent, racist mob, the Ku Klux Klan. Griffith was planning his great epic while he was filming his Poe-inspired Avenging Conscience in 1914. While these films explore different conflicts, one sees behind them both what Chico calls the points of identification between Poe and Griffith. Both were Southerners of a highly romantic persuasion, both attracted to very young women, and peculiarly moved by thoughts of their premature death. Both poetic spirits labored much of their time in popular media, and finally, both were alcoholics. Well, Poe was neither an alcoholic, strictly speaking, nor, in my view, a partisan Southerner. But this comparison illuminates the interest of The Avenging Conscience, in which a beautiful woman's death leaves her infant son in the hands of an overbearing uncle reminiscent of John Allen. The old man's efforts to control the nephew, an aspiring young writer, produces conflict, especially when he tries to thwart the writer's romance with lovely Annabelle. A Poe admirer, the nephew reads The Telltale Heart. The book he's reading there in the upper left has Poe's picture on the left page. As a Poe admirer, the nephew reads The Telltale Heart and quotes To One in Paradise as well as Annabel Lee. As the uncle becomes more meddlesome, he develops a bulging evil eye. I don't know the cause and effect there, but anyway. The nephew, inspired by a spider killing a fly, finally strangles him. And this crime precipitates not just the effect of guilt that Poe dramatized, the supposed beating of the dead man's heart, but also the nephew's visions. Here we go. The nephew's visions of Jesus on the cross chastising him, ugly ghouls haunting his imagination, a spectral skeleton, the apparition of a satin-framed religious motto, "Thou shalt not kill," and most persistently, images of the uncle's ghost reenacting his own strangulation. But because this nephew so strongly recalls Poe, Griffith can't bring himself to destroy his literary hero. Spoiler alert. Both the memory of the crime and its multiple effects derive from an overactive imagination. The nephew has dreamed all of it and reconciles with his uncle, and that's the center bottom picture, reconciles with his uncle, who relents and blesses the union with Annabelle. Here's my second spoiler alert. When the nephew and Annabelle sit down at the end of the film to read the young man's great literary work, Griffith stages a ludicrous tableau of springtime renewal involving Pan playing his pipes and half-dressed children representing buds and blossoms, and that's the picture in the lower right. Sorry if I've ruined this movie, but anyway. I much prefer the expressionist touches in Jean Epstein's Chute de la Maison Usher, the nocturnal mating frogs that signify incestuous desire. But the happy ending of Avenging Conscience provides an important insight into Birth of a Nation. Griffith's refusal to portray the homicidal violence of the Telltale Heart as gruesome and irrevocable, transforming it instead into a sweet story of reconciliation, prefigures the moral blindness of the Birth of a Nation, the refusal to see the Klan's brutalities as atrocities because, for Griffith, Aryan racial superiority renders the killing of black people as meaningless as a spider eating a fly. What matters to Griffith is that a white nation has been reborn by setting aside the quarrel about race and slavery that provoked a war in 1861. There is no avenging conscience in the Birth of a Nation, no conscience whatsoever. And Griffith could not understand the backlash to his film because he could not discern that lack. For much the same reason, he could not appreciate Poe's satire of Anglo-Saxon arrogance. Reginald Horseman, this is my last paragraph, Reginald Horseman closes Race and Manifest Destiny by probing the motives for emerging U.S. preoccupations with race in the 75 years between the American Revolution and the middle of the 19th century. He concludes, at the heart of the American and Western European consignment of other races to an inferior, lesser human status was the need to justify exploitation and destruction. Anglo-Saxons could continue to regard themselves as virtuous, civilized folk only if they demonized the people of color they chose to dominate. This is the logic of the Birth of a Nation and the racial hubris that Poe mocked, despite his own prejudices about race. In letters to both James Russell Lowell and Thomas Shivers in 1844, Poe debunked the idea of U.S. cultural progress. His mummy brings the same unwelcome message. Much as Anglo-Saxon Americans wanted to believe that Western civilization culminated in their white republic, much as they believed that their color legitimated conquest of a mongrel Mexican population, such attitudes illustrated only the blinding racial self-delusion that has posed a recurrent obstacle to realizing the great principles of the American Declaration of Independence and the civic nationalism that would perpetuate liberty and justice for all.